It was a Saturday morning in Dayton, Ohio, and I was walking back across the Home Depot parking lot with a bag of sandpaper and a can of stain, not thinking about anything at all. The sky was that flat, bright blue you get in early spring. That's the strange part. Looking back, nothing about that morning felt like the start of something. I heard it before I saw it. A scrape, then a grunt, then the sound of something heavy shifting the wrong way in a truck bed. An older man in a Cubs cap and a worn canvas jacket was wrestling with a table saw built for 2 sets of hands and only had one. He had one end lifted, and gravity had the other. I set my bag down and took the other side without asking. We got it leveled together, and when it settled flat, he breathed out hard. "Appreciate it, son," he said. Then he turned toward the store entrance and lifted one hand, and she walked out. Green velvet coat, a black bag over one shoulder, a coil of tie-down straps in her hand. She'd been coming to help him the whole time. I'd just gotten there first. She stopped a few feet away, arms crossing, and the old man said, "Laura, this young man just saved your old man's back." She looked at me, not at the saw, not at him, at me. And she held that look a half-second longer than a stranger has any reason to. I didn't know her name yet. I didn't know it would matter. My name is Connor Hale. I'm 30 years old, and I live in Dayton, Ohio, where I work as a finished carpenter, a one-man operation. No crew, no office, just a truck and a set of tools I trust more than most people. My work is cabinets, custom millwork, built-in shelving, commercial build-outs, the kind of job where nothing in the world is actually level, and yet somehow, it still has to look like it is. I didn't start out this way. In my mid-20s, I had a desk job at a construction management firm, supervising crews on bigger jobs, wearing a badge that said something with the word manager in it. It was a good job, on paper. Steady pay, a title, a parking spot with my name on it. Then, when I was 27, the company restructured, and my whole department disappeared in the space of one afternoon. No warning, no slow wind-down, just a meeting and a box for my desk. I didn't look for another office job after that. I went back to what I'd actually done every summer in college, which was carpentry real work you can put your hand on at the end of the day and know exactly what you built, instead of a spreadsheet that told you what other people had built for you. I got married at 26 and divorced at 28. She left around the same time the restructuring happened, and she said she couldn't picture where we were going anymore. I don't think she was wrong, honestly. I just wish it hadn't taken losing a job for either of us to say it out loud. No kids, no complicated custody, nothing dramatic, just a quiet ending that somehow still took far too long to actually feel quiet. I rent a 2-bedroom house on the east side of town now. I use the second bedroom as a workshop. I drive a truck that's 8 years old and still runs exactly the way it should, which is more than I can say for most things from that part of my life. There's one habit I've carried since I was 19, from the first job I ever had, working for a man named Garrett. I always keep a yellow carpenter's pencil behind my ear. Garrett used to say a carpenter without a pencil is just a man with lumber, and somewhere along the way that stopped being his line and became a fact about me. I don't even notice it's there most days. Other people notice it before I do. I know now what I didn't know that Saturday morning in the parking lot. The old man's name was Ray Whitfield, 68 years old, a retired machinist who still spent his weekends in a garage full of half-finished woodworking projects. The table saw was a Craftsman he'd owned since the late 80s, which went a long way toward explaining why it weighed what it weighed and fought back the way it did. After Ray introduced his daughter, the three of us stood there maybe 4 minutes. Laura handed him the tie-down straps. I helped loop them across the bed of the truck, and we exchanged first names and nothing else. When I finished tightening the last strap, she said, "Thank you, Connor," my name in her voice, for the first time, like she was testing how it sat in her mouth before she committed to it. Then I got in my truck and drove away, and that should have been the entire story. A man helps a stranger load a table saw on a Saturday morning, and life moves on the way it always does. No follow-up, no reason to expect one. That's what I told myself, anyway, for about 3 weeks, going through the ordinary routine of estimates and callbacks and jobs that came and went the way they always do in this line of work. Then I picked up a new contract, a commercial renovation, an office suite in a building on 5th Street downtown, finished carpentry from the ground up. I signed the paperwork without reading every line as closely as I should have, the way you do when a job is exactly what you need. It wasn't until later that evening, going back through it, that I saw the name listed as the property contact. Laura Whitfield. Whitfield and Associates. The first walkthrough happened on a Tuesday morning. I was already inside the suite, measuring for the first run of cabinetry, when I heard the door and turned around. And there she was, clipboard in hand, blazer instead of velvet this time, but unmistakably the same woman from the parking lot. There was a half-second pause when she saw me, just long enough that I caught it, and then she recovered. Professional, all business, like she decided in that half-second exactly how this was going to go. She didn't bring up the parking lot. I did. Small world, I said, and she allowed herself a small smile, the first crack in the professional surface. Small city, she corrected, and that was that we moved on to permits and timelines like two people who'd never stood together over a table saw. The job itself was a 2,400 square foot office suite, new cabinetry throughout, trim work, a long run of built-in shelving along the east wall. The other trades had already finished, which meant I mostly had the space to myself, hours at a time with nothing but the radio and the smell of fresh-cut oak drifting up into the light coming through the big windows facing 5th Street. It was the kind of job I liked best, quiet, unhurried, no other crews stepping over my extension cords, just me and the wood, and enough silence to actually think while I worked. I didn't expect to see much of Laura Whitfield beyond that first walkthrough. I figured she'd sign off on the permits, check in once or twice before the final inspection, and that would be the extent of it. I was wrong. She stopped by twice that first week, both times with a reason that made sense on paper, a tenant question, a permit filing that needed my signature. Both times she stayed a few minutes longer than either of those things actually required. She'd stand near the sawhorses in her office clothes, careful not to get sawdust on the hem of her coat, watching me work without saying much, and when she did ask a question, she listened to the whole answer instead of just nodding through it on her way back to her car, which is rarer than people think. Most people ask a question because they feel like they should. She asked like she actually wanted to know. She noticed the pencil on the third day. I'd reached up to grab it without thinking, the way I always do, and she tilted her head slightly. "Do you always work with that behind your ear?" I told her about Garrett, about the line he used to say, about how it had stopped being his line at some point and just became a fact about me. She nodded slowly, like she was filing the information away somewhere she'd want to find it again later. Sometime in the second week, Ray called me directly. He'd seen the job site sign out front with my number on it, looked it up, and asked if I'd take a look at a porch railing that had gone soft on him. His voice on the phone had the same dry, unhurried quality it had in the parking lot, like he was doing me a favor by asking rather than the other way around. I said yes before he even finished the sentence. I didn't mention it to Laura. It didn't occur to me that I needed to. It felt like a separate thing entirely, a favor for an old man. Nothing that had anything to do with the job on 5th Street. Around the same time, I started noticing that her visits were shifting mornings instead of midday, earlier than the actual business of the building required. She brought me coffee once, held it out without asking how I took it, and it was black, and it was right, which is a small thing, except it isn't. Not really. Every visit still came with a stated reason, a permit question, a tenant concern, a message from the building manager she could have easily sent by email. But the reasons were getting thinner, and either she didn't notice that I noticed, or she didn't care that I did. I drove out to Ray's place the following Sunday. It was a 1970s ranch house on the west side of town, well kept, the kind of yard that gets mowed on a schedule, whether it needs it or not, with a workshop out back that looked better organized than most professional shops I'd been in. Ray worked beside me on the porch the whole afternoon, handing me tools before I asked for them, not exactly making the job easier, but not getting in the way of it either. There was a comfortable rhythm to it, the two of us trading a socket wrench back and forth without needing to talk about what came next. He had that particular way some older men have of telling you something important by talking about something else entirely, circling it for 20 minutes before he ever got close. He told me about his late wife first, how she'd planted the dogwood by the driveway, how the porch had been her idea to begin with, how she used to sit out here with her coffee, even in the cold months, wrapped in a blanket, watching the street. His voice didn't change when he talked about her, but his hands slowed down a little, like the memory needed more room than the sentence did. Then, almost as an afterthought, like it wasn't the point of the sentence at all, he said, "Laura had a fella for a few years. Loud guy. Nice car. She was quieter the whole time she was with him." He didn't look at me when he said it. He kept his eyes on the railing, running his thumb along a joint we'd just set. I didn't ask him to say more, and he didn't offer more. But I understood exactly what he was telling me, and I carried it with me the rest of the afternoon without knowing what to do with it yet. Back at the site that week, Laura showed up a third time in 5 days, and this time, she didn't bother with a reason at all. She just admitted it, said the building manager had a question, but she could have handled it over the phone just as easily. She didn't explain why she'd driven over instead. I didn't ask. There was a silence between us after that, but it wasn't the uncomfortable kind. It was the kind that sits there because neither person wants to be the one to fill it with something smaller than what it actually is. I kept sanding a piece of trim I didn't strictly need to sand again, just to have something for my hands to do while the quiet stretched out between us. I showed her the shelving I'd been building along the east wall, a long run of oak, still raw, waiting on stain. She ran her hand along the edge of one of the test panels, slow, like she was checking something more than the finish. "It's smoother than it looks like it should be," she said. "That's the point," I told her. She looked up at me then, and it was the same look from the parking lot all over again, held a half-second longer than it needed to be, like she was deciding something and hadn't quite finished deciding it. I drove home that night with Ray's words still sitting somewhere in the back of my mind. She was quieter the whole time she was with him. I thought about what it means to take up space in someone's life without ever meaning to shrink them. I thought about how some people are loud without raising their voice at all, and how the quiet ones are usually the ones actually paying attention. I stopped at a light on the way home and caught myself still turning the sentence over, trying to figure out what exactly I was supposed to do with it, or whether I was supposed to do anything with it at all. I didn't know yet how much that thought was going to matter. I just knew it wouldn't leave me alone, and that the next time I saw her at the site, I'd be looking at her a little differently, whether I meant to or not. He showed up on a Tuesday. Work boots too clean to have ever seen a real job site, a polo shirt under a fleece vest with a company logo I didn't recognize, moving through the suite with the easy confidence of a man who's used to being let in wherever he goes without ever having to explain why. He had a vendor badge clipped to his collar, legitimate, from what I could tell, tied to the flooring work done in the building a couple of years back, before my time on the project. I watched his eyes move across my work table before he said a word, and I watched them land on the project coordination sheet clipped to the corner of it, with Laura's name printed right at the top. Something in his face shifted, just slightly, the way a person's expression changes when they've confirmed something they suspected rather than learned something new. It was such a small thing that I almost didn't catch it, and if Ray hadn't told me what he told me a week earlier, I probably wouldn't have. "Marcus Doyle," he said, holding out a hand. "Did the flooring install here a couple years back. Just stopping by. Figured I'd see how the place is coming along." I shook his hand and told him it was coming along fine. We talked for about 4 minutes, and nothing he said was technically out-of-line questions about the timeline, the scope, how long I'd been on the job, but every sentence curved back toward the same handful of things. How long had I been working with Laura? How often did she come by the site? Whether we'd worked together before this project? I gave him nothing useful, mostly because I didn't have anything to give. I didn't know yet what he was actually asking, or why a man I'd never met cared how often Laura Whitfield stopped by a job site on 5th Street. He left the way he'd come in, easy and unhurried, shaking my hand again on the way out like we were old colleagues wrapping up a friendly conversation. I stood there afterward with a distinct feeling that something had just happened to me, even though I couldn't have said exactly what it was. It sat wrong in a way I couldn't put words to yet. 3 days later, Laura came by, and something had changed. She was all business clipboard up, moving through the space efficiently, checking boxes instead of watching me work the way she had every other time. Gone was the woman who'd run her hand along the shelving just to feel the finish. When I said good morning, she answered, but she didn't stop moving. I asked if there was a problem with the work. She said no, the work was fine, and she was gone in 11 minutes, which was the shortest visit she'd made since the project started. I stood there afterward with a level in my hand, not using it, just holding it, trying to work out what I'd done wrong between one visit and the next. Ray called that same week, no idea anything had shifted, just to tell me that Laura had mentioned my name at dinner, out of nowhere, in the middle of talking about something else entirely. He said it with a kind of quiet satisfaction in his voice, like he was handing me something valuable without fully realizing what it was worth. "She doesn't do that," he said. I didn't tell him about the coldness at the site. I didn't know what I would have said, and I didn't want to hand him a worry he couldn't do anything about. Marcus came back on a Friday afternoon, and this time, the pleasantness was gone entirely. He found me at the shelving unit, hands in his jacket pockets, voice level and calm in a way that felt more deliberate than casual. He told me he'd known Laura for 4 years, that they had plenty of mutual contacts across the downtown property management world, people who talked to each other regularly at the kind of events I never got invited to, that there was a second phase of renovation being discussed for this building, and that his firm was being considered as a vendor for it, along with the flooring contract they'd already done here once before. He said all of this the way a man lays out a resume, calm and unbothered, like he wasn't really talking to me so much as reading me a list of reasons I should already understand. He never said it outright, he didn't need to. The shape of it was clear enough without the words, "step back," or "this gets complicated for you." It was the kind of thing said just carefully enough that if I repeated it back to anyone, it would sound like nothing at all. Then he looked at the pencil behind my ear and said, "She's not going to end up with a guy who carries a pencil behind his ear." He didn't say it cruelly. He said it like he was stating a fact about the world, the same way you'd mention the weather, like it wasn't even worth arguing about. I let him finish. I didn't fill the silence after he stopped talking, and eventually he seemed to run out of things to say into it. He glanced around the suite once more, like he was pricing it, and then he left without another word. After he was gone, I stood at the shelving unit with one hand on the frame, feeling something I recognized from the worst parts of my divorce, the old, familiar pull toward making things easier by simply disappearing. It would have been easy. Finish the job, collect the check, never come back to this building again, let Laura Whitfield go back to whatever life Marcus Doyle thought she belonged in. But I thought about Ray in that parking lot, too proud to ask for help, struggling alone with a saw that was too heavy for one man, and how nobody had thought to offer until I did. I thought about how easy it would have been to keep walking that morning, how nothing would have looked different from the outside if I had, and I decided I wasn't going to let another man's certainty about my life make the decision for me, not now, and not because he'd shown up twice with a badge and a friendly handshake. What I didn't know yet was that Marcus hadn't only come to see me, he'd reached out to a mutual colleague at Laura's firm too. Someone who crossed paths with her regularly at industry mixers and building association meetings and planted the same idea in a different direction, that I was angling for the commercial account, that the friendliness at the job site was strategy dressed up as warmth, nothing more calculated than a contractor working an angle he thought would pay off. It's a believable story, if you don't know the person it's being told about. Laura didn't confront me about any of it. She didn't call me and ask if it was true, or give me the chance to tell her it wasn't. She just pulled back, quietly, the way a person does when they've been burned once already by somebody who was only ever performing and who's learned it's safer to assume the worst than to be wrong again in the same direction. I texted her that Friday night. "Can we talk not about the project?" 20 minutes passed before she answered. Long enough that I started composing a second message just to fill the silence, then deleted it, then sat there staring at the phone like it might explain itself if I waited long enough. Her reply, when it came, was one word: "Okay," nothing more. I read it 4 times before I set the phone down. We met at the site after hours. The building was empty, the hallway lights on their motion sensor timers, flickering on ahead of us in sequence as we walked toward the suite, my truck the only one left in the lot besides her car. I was still in my work clothes, sawdust on my forearms, when she came in and stood just inside the door, keys still in her hand, like she hadn't quite decided to stay yet. We ended up standing in the unfinished suite, the shelving 3/4 done, that raw wood smell still thick in the air, one work light burning in the corner and throwing everything else into shadow. It wasn't neutral ground. This was entirely my space, and I think we both knew it, but neither of us said so. She glanced around at the half-finished shelving like she was seeing it for the first time, even though she'd walked past it a dozen times by then. I told her what Marcus had said not to make him look bad, but because she deserved to know what had been said in her name, by a man who apparently felt entitled to speak for her future without asking her opinion of it. I told it to her plainly, no editorializing, just the facts of the conversation as they happened. She went very still. It wasn't surprise on her face. It was something closer to recognition, like she was hearing a pattern she already knew by heart, being described back to her from a new angle, one more piece of evidence for a case she'd already made against him a long time ago. "He told people at the firm I was going back to him," she said finally, her voice even but tight around the edges. "He does that, says things early, so by the time anyone checks, they've already become true in everyone's head. It's how he's always operated. I should have warned you." A pause. Then, quieter. "What he told you about the account, The second phase that's not nothing. He does have that contact. It's not a bluff. I know, I said. And you're still here. I'm still here. Neither of us said anything for a moment after that. She walked over to the shelving unit and ran her thumb along the edge, the same motion as before, almost without noticing she was doing it. Then, still looking at the wood instead of at me, she said, I kept finding reasons to come back here because I didn't want to admit I didn't need one. I've been doing that for 6 weeks. And then she turned to face me. The parking lot. When my dad introduced us, I recognized something. I don't know how to say it any better than that. I reached up and took the pencil from behind my ear, an old habit whenever I need something to do with my hands while I'm thinking. I turned it once between my fingers, feeling the worn edge where I'd held it 1,000 times before. Your dad told me you were quieter when you were with Marcus, I said. I didn't ask him to tell me that. He just said it, out on his porch, like it mattered more than the railing we were fixing. I've been thinking about it ever since, trying to figure out what I was supposed to do with it. She looked at the pencil in my hand, and then at me, and something in her face eased, like a held breath finally letting go. I don't feel quiet around you, she said, simple as that, like it was the most obvious observation in the world, and she was only just now allowing herself to say it out loud. Neither of us said anything else that night that needed saying out loud. Some things get settled in a room without a single additional word, and this was one of them, the two of us standing in a half-finished room full of sawdust. No music, no plan, just the quiet certainty that whatever this was, it wasn't going to disappear the way I'd almost let it. 2 days later, the building owner got a call from Marcus's firm, offering to bundle the second phase renovation under the existing flooring contract at a discount, no bidding process required, framed as a favor to a building he'd already worked in before. The owner, following protocol, called Laura for her assessment before making any decision, the way he always did, on vendor matters that touched her properties. On the record, she told him that my work had become the standard she expected for the building going forward, and that if Marcus's firm wanted future work here, they'd go through the same bidding process as every other vendor, same as anyone else, with no exceptions made for old contracts or old contacts. Marcus didn't call again. Not the owner, not Laura, not me. Whatever he'd been building towards simply stopped. The way these things sometimes do, once the person on the other end of them refuses to play along anymore, once the leverage he thought he had turns out not to hold any weight at all. I never heard his name again after that, not once, and I found I didn't miss the sound of it. I finished the renovation on budget, 2 days ahead of schedule, which almost never happens in this line of work, no matter how carefully you plan it. There's always a supplier delay, a measurement that's off by 1/16 of an inch, something that eats into the buffer you built in for exactly that reason. This time, everything just went the way it was supposed to. Laura was there for the final walkthrough with the building manager, checking off the last items on a list that had gotten shorter every week for 2 months. Ray showed up too, unannounced. Though I found out later he'd called ahead in the middle of the week just to ask if it was close to done, and had apparently been counting down the days on his own kitchen calendar. He walked the room slowly, hands behind his back, running his fingers along the edge of the shelving without saying anything for a long stretch of time. Then he nodded once, more to himself than to anyone else, and said, "That'll hold." From Ray, that was practically a standing ovation. The building manager shook my hand and left, and for a moment it was just Laura and me in the finished suite, the smell of stains still faintly in the air. She put her hand on the shelving one more time, the same motion she'd made a dozen times before, and I reached up and put the pencil behind my ear out of habit. She laughed. Actually laughed. Not the polite half sound she usually gave, but something real that caught her off guard as much as it caught me. We didn't define anything, not right away. That's not really how it went, and I don't think either of us wanted to rush past what we'd just come through to get somewhere with a label on it. We had dinner twice that first month, nothing formal, just a diner on the edge of downtown where the coffee was better than the food, and nobody hurried you out after the check came. She showed up at a different job site once, unannounced, with lunch for both of us, sitting on an overturned bucket while I worked because there wasn't anywhere else to sit and neither of us minded. We went to a hardware store together on a Saturday, which was such an ordinary errand that it was almost funny how much I looked forward to it. How I found myself hoping she'd want to come along the next time too. Ray called me more than Laura did in those early weeks, which I found funny and didn't mention to her for almost 2 weeks. When I finally told her, she laughed again and said, He likes you better than most people I've brought home." Then she caught herself, backtracked. "Not that you've been home." She gave up trying to fix the sentence halfway through and just let it sit there between us, half finished, which somehow said more than if she'd smoothed it over. Around the third month, she told me about the years with Marcus, not as a wound she was showing me, just as information, laid out plainly the way you'd explain the layout of a house you used to live in. She told me how she'd learned to take up less space in her own life to make more room for his, how she'd started scheduling her own building walkthroughs at odd hours, early mornings mostly, because those were the only hours in the week that felt entirely like hers. I told her about the restructuring in return, and the divorce, and the decision to go back to actual carpentry after years behind a desk. I told her the office job had always felt like a costume I was wearing to a job I didn't actually have, and that sawdust and a pencil behind my ear had always felt like the real thing, the truth underneath whatever else I'd been trying to be. 6 months in, Ray had a health scare, a cardiac episode, minor, caught early enough by his doctor that it never became the emergency it could have been, but serious enough that they kept him in the hospital 2 days for monitoring before sending him home. Laura didn't say much on the phone the day it happened. She called me from the hospital parking lot, and I was there in 20 minutes, and I didn't ask her what she needed. I just got in the car and sat with her, and that turned out to be exactly the right thing to do. Ray came home 2 days later, made his own coffee that first morning, and complained about the hospital food the entire time he was making it, like the 2 days away had given him a whole new list of grievances to work through out loud. On the second day back, he pulled me aside, not Laura, just me, out by the porch we'd fixed together, and said, "I'm not asking you anything. I'm just saying I sleep better." That was the whole conversation. He didn't wait for me to respond, just went back inside to argue with Laura about whether he was allowed to carry his own grocery bags. I nodded at the empty porch. It was enough. It was more than enough. 12 months from that first Saturday, I'm standing in my kitchen on another Saturday morning, late light coming through the window over the sink. Laura is making coffee, moving around my kitchen the way she moves around it now, like she's always known where everything is kept, reaching for the mugs on the second shelf without needing to look. The yellow carpenter's pencil is sitting on the counter between the sink and the coffee pot, right where she moved it a few weeks back because it kept rolling off the edge of the table whenever I set it down without thinking. And neither of us has ever mentioned moving it back. Ray is coming for lunch. I have a job starting Monday. A library reading room across town, built-in shelving from floor to ceiling. The kind of work that takes patience and comes out right if you let it. The kind of job that used to be exactly the sort of thing I dreamed about back when I was still stuck behind a desk. I watch Laura pour 2 cups of coffee, unhurried. And I think about that Saturday morning a year ago, the scrape of a table saw shifting wrong in a truck bed, the grunt of an old man losing a fight he shouldn't have had to fight alone, and the simple, unremarkable decision to set my bag down and take the other side. I didn't help Ray because I was trying to start anything. I helped because a man was struggling, and I was standing right there, close enough that walking past would have taken more effort than stopping did. That's the whole reason. This isn't a story about timing or fate lining up behind the scenes. It's a story about the fact that some things only happen if you go ahead and do them, instead of waiting to see if they'll happen on their own. I almost let Marcus's certainty stand in for my own. I almost let someone else's loud, confident version of the future crowd out the quieter one I actually wanted, the one I hadn't even let myself name yet. The pencil sits on my kitchen counter now because it kept rolling off the table, and Laura got tired of chasing it. That's the practical reason. But I look at it most mornings and think about Garrett, and the thing he used to say, that a carpenter without a pencil is just a man with lumber. I think that's true of most things in life. You have to bring the thing that makes you useful, and then show up and actually use it. Ray taught me something without meaning to. When he was alone with that saw, he wasn't going to ask anybody for help, but when someone offered, he let them. That's the harder part, if you ask me, not the offering, but the letting. I set my bag down in a parking lot because a man needed a hand, and it turned out that was the only credential that mattered. Have you ever had a moment where you stepped in without thinking, and it changed everything? Tell me about it in the comments. And I want to know, would you have walked away from what Marcus was threatening, or stepped back the way he wanted? If this story stayed with you, hit that like button. It takes 1 second, and it's what keeps stories like this one coming. Subscribe if you're new here, and I'll see you in the next one.